There are secrets that age you from the inside out, that sit in your chest like stones at the bottom of a cold river. I'm 55 years old now, and I've carried mine for 30 years. I'm telling you this because I'm tired, because the weight of it has become too much, and because I need someone, anyone, to know what happened in those woods before I die. My name is John Miller, and for 12 years of my life, I fed a Wendigo. I know what you're thinking. Wendigos are myths, campfire stories told to scare children, legends whispered by indigenous elders about creatures of insatiable hunger that roam the northern forests. I thought the same thing once. I was wrong. It was 1983 when I first moved to that cabin in northern Maine, about 40 miles from the Canadian border. I just quit the National Park Service after 15 years as a ranger. The job had eaten away at me. Too many tourists, too many rules, too much pretending that wilderness could be managed like a shopping mall. I wanted silence. I wanted trees that didn't have trail markers nailed into them. I wanted to disappear into a place where human voices were rare as winter roses. The cabin I bought was over 100 years old, built by loggers in the 1880s and abandoned since the 40s. It sat on 80 acres of dense pine and birch forest, with a creek running through the eastern edge of the property. The nearest town was Millbridge, population 312, a 30-minute drive on logging roads that turned to mud soup every spring. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Patricia with lipstick on her teeth, told me 3 separate times that I'd be very isolated out there. I signed the papers with a smile. That first year, I rebuilt the cabin from the bones up, replaced the roof, reinforced the foundation, installed a wood stove that could heat the whole place with half a cord of birch. I ran a generator for electricity 4 hours a day. I hauled water from the creek in 5-gallon buckets. I hunted deer and rabbit, grew potatoes and carrots in a small garden plot I cleared behind the cabin. It was hard, honest work, and for the first time in years, I slept through the night without dreaming about crowds. The forest became my companion. I learned its rhythms, the way the red squirrels chattered warnings when hawks circled overhead, how the barred owls called to each other at dusk, the paths the deer took between their bedding areas and the creek. I could tell the weather by the behavior of the chickadees. I knew where the moose rubbed the velvet from their antlers in early fall. The woods were a language I was finally fluent in. Winter came early that year. October snow that stayed on the ground until May. I loved it. Loved the way silence deepened when snow muffled the forest. Loved splitting wood in the crystalline cold, my breath hanging in clouds, my hands learning calluses they'd forgotten. The solitude was a kind of meditation. It was late November, maybe 3 months after I'd moved in, when I first noticed something was wrong. I'd strung up a deer carcass in a tree about 50 yards from the cabin, standard practice to keep it away from bears and coyotes while it aged. I'd checked it the night before, everything normal. But when I went out the next morning with my coffee steaming in the 15-degree air, the deer was gone. Not eaten on sight. Not dragged away with a clear trail. Just gone like someone had unhooked it and carried it off into the trees. The rope I'd used was still there, swaying in the morning wind, cut clean through. Not frayed like an animal had gnawed it. Cut. I stood there for a long time, my coffee going cold in my hands, staring at that rope. Bears don't use knives. Coyotes don't either. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, an old trapper named Eddie Gagnon who I'd met exactly once when I'd driven past his property line. He had no reason to steal my deer, and even if he did, he wouldn't have hiked through 3 feet of snow in the middle of the night to do it. I told myself it had to be Eddie anyway, or maybe some kid from town looking for trouble. But my gut, the same gut that had kept me alive through bad situations in the parks, told me something different. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. The tracks around the tree bothered me most. There were prints in the snow, but they were wrong. Too big to be human. Maybe 18 inches long and narrow. Barefoot in November in Maine. The stride was impossibly long, 7 or 8 feet between prints. And the depth, whatever had made those tracks was heavy, pressing down through the snow to the frozen earth beneath. I followed the tracks into the tree line. They headed north, deeper into the forest where the pines grew so thick the snow barely reached the ground. I'm not a superstitious man. Wasn't then, anyway. But following those tracks felt like following something that didn't want to be found, and the smart part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around. I didn't listen. The tracks led me 2 miles into the forest, into a part of my property I hadn't explored yet. The pines gave way to a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across, ringed by ancient hemlocks that had to be 300 years old. The snow in the clearing was trampled down, packed hard by something that had spent time there. And in the center, scattered across the frozen ground, were bones. Not my deer's bones. These were older, bleached white by weather and time. Leg bones from what looked like elk or moose. A skull I couldn't identify, elongated and wrong. And smaller bones, too, rabbits maybe or squirrels. It looked like a feeding ground, a place something came back to again and again. The smell hit me then. Even in the cold I could smell it, a mixture of decay and musk and something metallic that made my stomach turn. It reminded me of a meat locker that had lost power, that sickly sweet rot that gets into your sinuses and stays there. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was firing warning signals. But I'm a stubborn man, always have been, and I'd spent 15 years as a ranger investigating animal behavior. I told myself this was just an animal. A big one, sure, unusual, yes, but still explainable. Maybe a grizzly that had wandered down from Canada. Maybe a cougar, though they'd been extinct in Maine for decades. I started visiting that clearing every few days. I told myself I was being scientific, observational. The truth was I was obsessed. The tracks appeared regularly now, always at night, always heading to and from that clearing. Whatever it was, it had a routine. It came through my property, took whatever it wanted. Another deer I'd hung up, a rabbit from one of my snares, even some smoked fish I'd left hanging in my shed, and disappeared back into the deep woods. I never saw it. Not for weeks. But I felt watched. You know that feeling, that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're not alone? I felt it constantly. When I was splitting wood. When I was hauling water. When I was lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle and wondering if that creak was just the cold or something else. December came, and with it, a cold snap that dropped temperatures to 30 below. The creek froze solid. The trees cracked like rifle shots in the night from the cold. I burned through wood faster than I'd planned, and my hands were raw despite the gloves I wore. It was the kind of cold that makes you understand how people die in the wilderness. Not dramatically, not fighting off wolves or falling off cliffs, but quietly, just giving up and going to sleep in the snow. It was during that cold snap, on a night so clear the stars looked close enough to touch, that I finally saw it. I'd gone outside around midnight to piss off the porch. The outhouse was too cold to bother with, and when I looked up, it was there. Standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 40 feet away, perfectly still. It was tall. God, it was tall. 7 feet at least, maybe closer to 8. Skeletal thin, like something that had been starved for years, with limbs too long and joints that bent at angles that made my brain hurt to look at. The moonlight caught patches of fur or hair, I couldn't tell which, hanging in matted clumps from gray-white skin stretched so tight I could see the outline of its ribs. Its head was the worst part. Elongated, almost horse-like, but wrong. So wrong. Antlers sprouted from its skull, but broken, jagged, pointing in directions antlers shouldn't grow. And its eyes. Even in the darkness, I could see its eyes. They reflected the moonlight like an animal's, but the color was off. Not the green or yellow you'd expect, but a pale, milky blue that looked almost human. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour but was probably only 30 seconds. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Every animal instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there exposed on my porch. But I was frozen, locked in place by those eyes. Then it moved. Not toward me. It turned and walked back into the trees, its gait stilted and wrong like a puppet with loose strings. It made no sound. Not a footstep, not a breath. It was there, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness between the pines. I stood on that porch for another 10 minutes before my legs remembered how to work. When I finally went back inside, I locked the door, something I'd never done before, and sat by the wood stove until dawn, listening to my heart hammer in my chest. I knew what I'd seen. Knew it in my bones. The Ojibwe rangers I'd worked with in Minnesota used to tell stories about the Wendigo. Spirits of winter and starvation, they said. Cannibals transformed into monsters by their own hunger. I'd always smiled and nodded, filed it away with all the other folklore and legends. But I'd seen it. It was real. And it was living in my forest. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Tried to convince me I'd seen a malnourished moose, or a bear with mange, or that the moonlight and shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But I'm not a man who lies to himself, not anymore. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I had a choice to make. I could leave. Pack up, abandon the cabin, head back to civilization and try to forget those blue eyes staring at me from the tree line. Or I could stay. Could learn to live with whatever was out there in my woods. I stayed. I'm still not entirely sure why. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper, a recognition that this creature and I were both exiles, both seeking something the human world couldn't provide. Whatever the reason, I decided that if this thing wanted to live in my forest, I could learn to coexist with it. The first thing I did was start leaving food out deliberately. If it was going to steal from me anyway, I figured I might as well make it easier. I'd place offerings at the edge of the clearing I'd found. Deer meat when I had it, rabbit, fish from the creek in summer. Never near the cabin. Always in the same spot where that feeding ground was. A peace offering, I suppose. Or tribute. Or just an attempt to establish some kind of understanding. The food was always gone by morning. Always. And over time a pattern emerged. I'd leave the food at sunset. By dawn it would be gone, and sometimes, not always but sometimes, there'd be something left in return. A deer hide, scraped clean and folded. A pile of kindling, broken into perfect sizes for my stove. Once a stone with a hole worn through it by water, smooth and beautiful, sitting right where I'd left the meat. I started to understand that this wasn't just an animal. Animals don't trade. Animals don't fold deer hides or choose specific stones to leave as gifts. This thing, whatever it was, had intelligence, awareness, maybe even gratitude. The months passed. Winter gave way to spring, then summer. I fell into a routine. Every evening, just before dark, I'd walk out to the clearing with whatever offering I had. Sometimes we'd both be lucky and I'd have fresh venison. Other times it was just scraps or eggs from the chickens I'd started keeping, or bread I'd baked that hadn't turned out quite right. It didn't seem to matter. It took whatever I brought. I never saw it during those trips. Never heard it. But I always felt watched, and after a while, that feeling stopped being frightening. It became almost comforting, like having a neighbor who checked in on you without needing to knock on the door. I started talking during those walks. Just small things at first. Comments about the weather, about how the garden was doing, about a fox I'd seen that morning hunting voles in the meadow. I felt ridiculous doing it, talking to trees and empty air, but it also felt necessary. If this thing had intelligence, maybe it could understand. Maybe it wanted to understand. Cold tonight, I'd say, setting down a bucket of fish guts and salmon heads. Creeks running high from the rain. Caught these this morning. Hope you like them. Silence. Always silence. But the food was always gone. Summer brought new challenges. Tourists started showing up on the logging roads. Hikers from out of state looking for authentic wilderness experiences. I'd see their cars parked at the trailheads, their bright nylon tents pitched in clearings that had been empty for decades. They'd wave at me when I drove past, all smiles and expensive cameras, completely unaware of what lived in these woods. I worried that one of them would wander onto my property, would find that clearing, would see something they shouldn't. Worried more about what might happen to the creature if word got out. I'd worked for the government long enough to know what they did with things that didn't fit into neat categories. They studied them, captured them, destroyed them if necessary. I started posting no trespassing signs every 100 feet along my property line. Started driving the logging roads more often, making my presence known, making sure the hikers understood this was private land. Most people respected it. But there's always someone who thinks rules don't apply to them. It was late July, the height of summer, when Eddie Gagnon showed up at my cabin. I was working in the garden, pulling weeds from around the potato plants, when I heard his truck rattling up the road. Eddie was in his 70s, weathered as old leather, with hands like tree roots and a voice rough from 60 years of cigarettes. "John," he said, climbing out of his truck with a rifle slung over his shoulder. "We got a problem." Eddie stood there in my driveway, hat pushed back on his head, rifle catching the afternoon sun. My stomach dropped. I forced my face to stay neutral, kept my hands busy with the weeds I'd been pulling. "What kind of problem?" I asked, though I already knew. Somehow I already knew. "Something's been killing my dogs," Eddie said. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, but I could hear the anger underneath. 3 of them now. Best hunting dogs I ever had. Found the last one this morning, torn up about a quarter mile from my cabin. Whatever did it is big, John. Real big. I stood up slowly, wiping dirt from my hands. Bears are active this time of year. Maybe. Weren't no bear. Eddie cut me off, his eyes hard. "I've lived in these woods for 53 years. I know what a bear kill looks like. This was something else. Something I ain't never seen before." He paused, studying my face. "You seen anything unusual on your property?" The lie came easy. Too easy. "No. Nothing. Just the usual deer and moose." Eddie didn't look convinced. "There's tracks, John. Big ones. Heading toward your land. I was thinking maybe we could organize a hunt. Me, you, maybe a couple boys from town. Put an end to whatever this thing is before it kills something besides dogs." "I don't think that's necessary," I said, keeping my voice level. "Your dogs probably just ran into something territorial. A moose with a calf, maybe. Or they got into a porcupine. I wouldn't want to waste time hunting shadows." Eddie's jaw tightened. "This ain't shadows. This is real. And it's dangerous." He shifted the rifle on his shoulder. "I'm gonna find it, John. With or without your help. Just thought I'd give you a heads up, seeing as how it's been moving through your property." He left without another word, his truck kicking up dust as it bounced back down the logging road. I stood there watching until the sound of his engine faded into the forest, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was bad. Eddie wasn't a man who let things go. If he said he was going to hunt this thing, he meant it. And if he organized other men from town, if they came onto my property with rifles and dogs, they'd find the clearing. They'd find the evidence. And they'd find the creature. That evening, I walked out to the feeding ground earlier than usual, before the sun had even touched the horizon. I brought a haunch of venison, fresh from a deer I'd shot that morning, and set it down in the usual spot. Then I did something I'd never done before. I sat down and waited. The forest around me was alive with evening sounds. Thrushes singing their last songs before dark. The rustle of a porcupine moving through the underbrush. The distant drumming of a ruffed grouse. I sat on a fallen log and watched the shadows lengthen between the trees. Watched the sky turn from blue to purple to deep indigo. It came when the first stars appeared. I heard it before I saw it. The faint crack of a branch, the whisper of movement through the pines. Then it stepped into the clearing, and even though I'd seen it before, even though I'd been leaving food for it for months, my breath still caught in my chest. It looked worse than I remembered. Thinner, if that was possible. The fur hung in patches from its frame, revealing skin that looked like old parchment stretched too tight. The antlers on its head had grown since winter, but wrong, twisted back on themselves in a way that must have been painful. But it was the eyes, those pale blue eyes, that held me frozen. We looked at each other across the clearing. 30 feet of space between us. I could hear it breathing, a wet, raspy sound that rattled in its chest. It tilted its head, studying me with an intelligence that was undeniably human, and I understood with sudden clarity that this thing had once been a person. The legends were true. This was what happened when hunger and winter and desperation transformed a human being into something else. "They're coming for you," I said quietly. My voice sounded strange in the stillness. "Men with guns. They think you killed some dogs. They're going to hunt you." It didn't move. Didn't react. just kept staring at me with those terrible human eyes. I don't want them to find you, I continued. I don't want them to hurt you. But you can't stay in this part of the forest anymore. You need to go deeper. North, maybe. Into Canada where there's no one around. Still nothing. Just that raspy breathing and those eyes. I stood up, slowly, keeping my movements careful. I'll keep bringing food. I'll leave it farther out, closer to the northern boundary. Follow the creek upstream about 5 miles. There's another clearing there, bigger than this one. I'll meet you there instead. For a moment nothing happened. Then the creature took a step forward, and another, moving with that stilted wrong gait that made my skin crawl. It came close enough that I could smell it, that mix of decay and animal musk and something else, something that smelled like disease. Close enough that I could see the detail of its face, the way its skin pulled back from teeth that were too long, too sharp. Close enough to kill me without effort. It reached out one long, skeletal hand. The fingers were tipped with black claws, curved and wicked. I held my breath, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I stayed still. It touched the venison I'd brought, picked it up with a gentleness that seemed impossible from something so monstrous. Then it turned and walked back into the trees, carrying its meal, leaving me standing alone in the gathering dark. I realized I'd been holding my breath. When I finally let it out, it came as a shudder. Eddie came back twice over the next week, each time with more men. I watched from my cabin windows as they moved through the forest with their rifles and their dogs, following trails that led nowhere. I'd spent those days erasing evidence, covering tracks, dismantling the old feeding ground, scattering the bones that had accumulated there. By the time Eddie's hunting party reached it, the clearing looked like nothing more than a natural opening in the trees. You sure you haven't seen anything? Eddie asked me the second time, standing on my porch with 3 other men from Millbridge. They all had that same look, determined, suspicious, frustrated. Nothing, I lied, meeting his eyes without flinching. Whatever it was probably moved on. Wildlife does that. Territory disputes settle, and animals relocate. They searched for 2 more days before giving up. Eddie left with a warning. If I lose any more dogs, John, I'm coming back. And next time, I'm bringing state wildlife officials. I nodded, said nothing, and watched them drive away. That night, I hiked 5 miles upstream, following the creek by moonlight, carrying a pack full of smoked meat and dried fish. The new clearing was exactly where I remembered it. Larger than the first, surrounded by old-growth forest so thick the sun barely reached the ground. I left the food in the center and walked back to my cabin, my legs aching, my conscience heavier than the pack had been. The creature found it. I knew because 3 days later, when I returned, the food was gone and in its place was a gift unlike any before. A rabbit, freshly killed and cleaned, the meat still warm. It had hunted for me, had brought me food in return for what I'd provided. I sat down right there in the clearing and cried. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I cried for this thing that had once been human, that remembered enough of what it meant to be human that it understood reciprocity and gratitude. I cried for the loneliness it must feel, trapped in that monstrous body, unable to speak, unable to return to the world it had lost. And I cried for myself, for the strange bond I'd formed with something that shouldn't exist. The years passed. I settled into a routine that became as natural as breathing. Every 3 days, I'd make the hike up to the northern clearing with whatever food I could spare. Sometimes it was meat from successful hunts. Sometimes it was vegetables from my garden, or bread, or eggs. I learned what it preferred: venison over rabbit, fresh meat over dried, fish when nothing else was available. And it continued to leave gifts. Hides. Useful stones. Once, a piece of antler carved into something that might have been a tool or might have been art. I couldn't tell which. I never saw it again after that evening in the first clearing. But I knew it was there. Knew it was surviving because of what I brought. Knew it was waiting for me 3 times a week in that clearing 5 miles from anywhere. Seasons turned. Winter came and went, then came again. I got older. My knees started to ache on the long hikes. My hands grew more gnarled with arthritis. The cabin needed constant repairs, Roof leaks, cracked foundation stones, a wood stove that finally gave up and had to be replaced. But I stayed. Kept my routine. Kept feeding the creature that had become the strangest companion I'd ever had. People in Millbridge thought I was crazy. The hermit in the woods who talked to himself and never came to town except for supplies. Eddie Gagnon spread rumors that I'd gone feral, that living alone for so long had broken something in my brain. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had gone a little crazy. But it was a good kind of crazy, the kind that comes from choosing loyalty over convenience, from protecting something precious even when no one else could understand why it mattered. I was careful. Always careful. I varied my routes to the clearing so I wouldn't wear a visible trail. I never brought anyone to my property. I lied to the Forest Service rangers when they asked about unusual wildlife. I became a guardian of a secret that would have destroyed both of us if it ever got out. The 12th year was the hardest. I was 54 years old, and my body was wearing down faster than I wanted to admit. The hikes to the clearing left me exhausted for days. I developed a cough that winter that wouldn't go away, a deep rattle in my chest that reminded me too much of the creature's breathing. My doctor in Millbridge told me I needed to move somewhere with better access to healthcare, somewhere I wouldn't be so isolated. I smiled and nodded and ignored him. February came, and with it, the coldest temperatures I'd seen in years. 40 below zero for 3 straight weeks. The kind of cold that makes the trees explode from frozen sap. The kind of cold that kills you if you make one mistake. I was late with a feeding. The cold had kept me inside for days, and by the time I felt strong enough to make the hike, I was a week overdue. I loaded my pack at sunset, strapped on snowshoes, and headed into the forest under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. The hike nearly killed me. The cold was so intense it burned my lungs with every breath, even through the scarf I'd wrapped around my face. My fingers went numb inside my gloves within the first mile. My legs shook from exhaustion by mile 3. But I kept going, driven by something I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or loyalty, or just the stubborn refusal to break a promise I'd made to something that couldn't speak. I reached the clearing 2 hours after I'd started. The moon was almost full, reflecting off the snow so bright it was nearly like daylight. I dropped the pack in the center of the clearing, my hands shaking too badly to untie the straps properly. Food spilled out onto the snow. Frozen venison, a loaf of bread hard as stone, some dried fish that looked like leather. "Sorry I'm late," I said through chattering teeth. My voice sounded hollow in the empty clearing. The cold. I couldn't make it earlier. But I'm here now. I'm here. I stood there for a moment trying to catch my breath, trying to will warmth back into my body. Then I turned to head back to the cabin. That's when I heard it. A sound I'd never heard before in 12 years. A voice. Low and rasping, like wind through a cave, like something that hadn't spoken in decades remembering how to form words. "John." I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. Slowly, so slowly, I turned around. It was standing at the edge of the clearing. Closer than it had ever been. That skeletal frame, those twisted antlers, those pale blue eyes reflecting moonlight. But for the first time it had spoken. It knew my name. "You." I couldn't finish the sentence. My brain couldn't process what I'd just heard. It took a step closer. Then another. The snow crunched under its feet, the first sound I'd ever heard it make while moving. When it spoke again, each word seemed to cause it pain, like its throat had forgotten the shape of human language. "You kept coming." I nodded, unable to speak. 12 years. The words came slowly, with long pauses between them. Every winter. Every storm. You came. "Yes," I managed. I promised I would. It tilted its head, studying me with those 2 human eyes. Why? The question hung in the frozen air between us. Why had I done this? Why had I spent 12 years hiking through blizzards and heat, risking my safety and my sanity to feed a monster? "Because you were hungry," I said finally. "Because you needed help. Because—" I paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound insane. "Because I understood what it's like to be alone, to be something the world doesn't have a place for." The creature made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. It was impossible to tell. I was a man once. Do you know that? I figured, I said quietly. Winter of 1893. Mining camp. In Quebec. We ran out of food. The others died. It stopped, as if the memory was too painful to continue. I survived. But the price. I understood then. Understood what the old stories had been trying to tell me. The Wendigo wasn't a monster that hunted humans. It was what happened when humans crossed a line they could never uncross. When survival demanded something so terrible that it transformed you into something that could never be human again. How long? I asked. How long have you been like this? 90 years. More. The creature's voice was getting stronger, as if speaking was like exercising a muscle that had atrophied. I thought I would die. Wanted to die. But I couldn't. The hunger won't let me die. The food I brought, did it help? Yes. For the first time, something like emotion entered its voice. For 12 years, I was not just a monster. I was something cared for. Something remembered. We stood there in the moonlight, the temperature dropping even further, the cold so intense it felt like the air itself might shatter. I should have been terrified. Should have been running back to my cabin, locking the door, calling the authorities. Instead, I felt something else, a deep aching sadness for this thing that had been trapped in a nightmare for nearly a century. What was your name? I asked. Before. Thomas. The word came out like a sigh. Thomas. Beaumont. Thomas. I repeated. I'm glad I could help, Thomas. I'm glad you weren't alone. The creature, Thomas, took another step closer. We were only 10 feet apart now. Close enough that I could see the detail of its face, the suffering etched into every line of its inhuman features. Close enough to see moisture in those pale blue eyes that might have been tears. I must go, it said. Soon. The hunger gets worse. Even with your gifts. I feel it growing. I will go north, where there are no people, where I cannot hurt anyone. When? The word came out sharper than I intended. When winter ends. When I am strong enough for the journey. I nodded, trying to swallow past the lump in my throat. I'll keep bringing food until then. As much as I can carry. John. My name again, spoken with something that sounded like gratitude. Thank you for seeing a man, when everyone else would see only monster. I made 8 more trips to that clearing before the snow began to melt. Each time, I brought everything I could carry. Meat, dried goods, even some of my dwindling emergency supplies. Each time, Thomas was there, waiting in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. We spoke briefly, his voice growing clearer with each conversation, as if using language again was healing something inside him that had been broken for decades. He told me fragments of his story. About the mining camp in Quebec where he and 7 other men had tried to ride out a winter that killed everything. About the slow starvation, watching his companions die one by one. About the decision that damned him, choosing survival over humanity. He didn't give me details, and I didn't ask. Some things are better left unspoken. But he also told me about the years after. The decades of isolation, of hiding, of fighting against the hunger that defined his existence. He'd tried to die, he said. Tried walking into the sun in summer. Tried freezing himself in winter storms. Tried going without food for months. But the transformation that had taken his humanity had also taken his ability to die by any normal means. He was cursed to endure. The hunger, he told me one night, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not like normal hunger. It's everything. All the time. Even when I eat. It's never enough. Your gifts, they help. They quiet it. For a while. But it always comes back. I understood then why he had to leave. Why staying, even with regular food, wasn't sustainable. The curse that had transformed him wasn't something that could be managed or controlled. It could only be endured, and endurance required distance from anything human. March brought the thaw. The creek ran high with meltwater. The snow retreated into the shadows under the pines. Birds returned, robins and bluebirds and red-winged blackbirds calling from the marshes. The forest came alive again, and with that life came the knowledge that Thomas's time here was ending. Our last meeting was on the first truly warm day of spring. I'd brought a full pack, 40 pounds of supplies, everything I could spare. The hike nearly broke me. I had to stop every few hundred yards to catch my breath, to let the pain in my knees subside. But I made it. Thomas was already there when I arrived, standing in the center of the clearing in the late afternoon sun. In the daylight, he looked even more impossible, a creature that shouldn't exist, that defied every natural law. But I'd learned not to see the monster. I saw Thomas, a man who had survived the unsurvivable and paid a price that no one should have to pay. "This is goodbye," he said as I set down the pack. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I will go far north, into the territories where there are no people, where I can harm no one, where the hunger doesn't matter. Will you survive?" The question came out before I could stop it. Thomas made that sound again, the one that might have been a laugh. "I have survived 90 years. I will survive more. But I will not come back. Too dangerous. Too much risk. For you. For everyone." I understood that this moment was an ending, that after 12 years of strange companionship, I was losing something I hadn't realized had become important to me. Not just the routine or the purpose, but the connection. The knowledge that somewhere in these woods, someone knew me. Someone saw me. Someone I'd helped survive. "Thank you," I said, and my voice cracked. "For trusting me. For letting me help." "No," Thomas said, and for the first time his voice was clear. Strong. Almost human. "Thank you, John Miller, for reminding me that I was once a man. For 12 years, you gave me dignity. You gave me hope. You gave me friendship. I will carry that into the darkness. And when the hunger threatens to consume everything, I will remember that someone cared, that someone saw past the monster." He picked up the pack I'd brought, slinging it over his skeletal shoulder like it weighed nothing. Then he did something I never expected. He extended his hand, that terrible clawed hand, toward me. I took it. His skin was cold as ice, rough as tree bark, but the gesture was unmistakably human. A handshake. A farewell between friends. "Goodbye, Thomas," I said. "Goodbye, John." He turned and walked into the forest, heading north, toward the deep wilderness where maps ran out and human presence ended. I watched until I couldn't see him anymore, until he was just a shadow moving between trees, and then not even that. I stood in that clearing until the sun touched the horizon, until the temperature dropped and my breath began to fog in the evening air. Then I picked up my empty pack and began the long walk back to my cabin, knowing that I'd never make this journey again. That was 30 years ago. I'm 55 now, sitting in the same cabin, writing this all down for the first time. My hands shake from more than just age. They shake from the weight of carrying the secret for 3 decades, from the knowledge that I helped something impossible survive, from the certainty that no one will ever believe me. I never saw Thomas again. Never found any evidence that he still exists somewhere in the northern wilderness. Some nights, I like to imagine he made it to a place so remote that the hunger doesn't matter anymore, where he can exist without fear of hurting anyone. Other nights, I wonder if the curse finally released him, if he found some way to die that had eluded him for 90 years. I don't know which outcome I hope for. The cabin has gotten older like me. The roof leaks in new places. The wood stove protests every time I light it. My garden has shrunk to a few rows of potatoes and carrots, all I can manage with my arthritic hands. Eddie Gagnon died 7 years ago, buried in the cemetery in Millbridge next to 3 generations of his family. The logging roads have grown over, barely passable even with a good truck. The forest has reclaimed everything human, the way it always does eventually. But I'm still here. Still living in isolation, still keeping my secret, still walking out to that northern clearing 3 times a week even though I know no one's waiting there. It's become a kind of meditation, I suppose. A way of honoring what happened, of keeping faith with a promise I made decades ago. People in town think I'm crazy. They're probably right. I'm the old hermit who lives in the woods, who talks to himself, who sometimes shows up at the general store looking haunted and buying way more food than one person could possibly eat. They humor me, take my money, watch me drive away in my ancient truck. They don't know what I've seen. Don't know what I've protected. I've thought about telling someone. About writing this down and giving it to a newspaper or a wildlife biologist, or even just posting it on the internet where stories go to live and die in the span of a day. But I never do. Because Thomas trusted me. Trusted me to keep him safe, to keep his existence hidden from a world that would turn him into a specimen, a monster to be studied and destroyed. I won't betray that trust, even now that he's gone. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. If the isolation drove me mad and I invented an entire companionship with a creature from legend. If those 12 years of hiking and feeding and talking were just elaborate delusions. But then I look at the things Thomas left me. The scrape hides I still have in my shed, the carved antler piece on my mantel, the dozens of useful stones that sit in a box under my bed. They're real. He was real. And sometimes, late at night when the wind moves through the pines and the temperature drops below 0, I hear something that might be footsteps in the snow. Something large, moving through the forest with that stilted, wrong gait. Something that remembers the cabin where a stubborn man once kept a promise. I don't go outside on those nights. Don't investigate. Because I hope, that Thomas found what he was looking for in the far north. Found peace, or at least the closest thing to peace that a cursed man can find. And if something is out there in my woods, I'd rather believe it's just an echo, just a memory of what was, rather than proof that he failed to escape. I'm tired now. Tired in a way that goes deeper than physical exhaustion. I've spent 30 years carrying the weight of an impossible truth, and I think I've finally reached the point where I need to set it down. That's why I'm writing this. Why I'm telling you this story that sounds like madness, that flies in the face of everything rational and scientific and real. I fed a Wendigo for 12 years. His name was Thomas Beaumont. He was a man who made a terrible choice and paid a price that lasted nearly a century. And for 12 years I gave him something that the curse couldn't take away. Dignity, compassion, and the reminder that humanity isn't defined by what we look like or what we've become, but by how we treat each other in the darkness. The world is full of monsters. Some of them look like creatures from nightmares. But I've learned that the real monsters are the ones who see suffering and turn away. Who see someone in need and choose convenience over compassion. Who would rather destroy what they don't understand than try to protect it. Thomas taught me that. Taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is feed a monster and hope it remembers what it means to be human. Taught me that loyalty and kindness matter more than fear. Taught me that we're all just trying to survive in a world that doesn't always have room for what we've become. I don't know how much longer I have. My health is failing, the cold winters are getting harder to endure, and eventually, this old cabin is going to collapse around me. When I die, and it won't be long now, this story will die with me. Unless you believe it. Unless you understand what I'm trying to tell you. There are things in the woods that don't fit into our neat categories. There are stories that sound impossible but are true nonetheless. There are friendships that form in the unlikeliest places, between the unlikeliest beings. And sometimes the most human thing you can do is show compassion to something inhuman. I'd do it again if I had the choice. Every cold hike, every exhausted return to the cabin, every moment of fear and wonder. I'd do it all again, because for 12 years I wasn't alone. For 12 years, I had a purpose that mattered more than comfort or safety or what anyone else thought. Thomas is gone now, disappeared into the northern wilderness like smoke into sky. But his memory remains, carried in these words, in the gifts he left me, in the knowledge that I kept faith with something the world would have destroyed. If you're reading this, I hope you understand. I hope you see past the impossibility to the truth underneath, that we're all just trying to survive, to find connection, to be seen as more than the sum of our worst moments. That sometimes, keeping a promise to a monster is the most human thing you can do. My name is John Miller. I'm 55 years old. And I fed a Wendigo for 12 years, until it finally spoke to me one February night and called me friend. That's my confession. That's my secret. That's the truth I've carried for 30 years. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat.